is Sunday, November 29th, 2020, 5 o'clock p.m. Like off yellow Saturday, there is no known color for Sunday, the Sunday after Thanksgiving. So we're going to make one up. It's going to be after the color of Kate's shirt today. From here on after...
Faded denim.
After Thanksgiving is kind of light denim Sunday. So we've got Black Friday, we've got off yellow Saturday, and we've got light denim Sunday before we get to Cyber Monday. For those of you who haven't yet lost track of time, because it's COVID time, so that we're all basically lost track of time, and then compound that with Thanksgiving weekend when you always lose track of time. So now we are all officially in the state of Sigourney Weaver at the beginning of the second Alien movie, when she wakes up and doesn't realize that 57 years have passed.
You couldn't have gone with Rip Van Winkle there? You went with Sigourney Weaver in the second Alien movie?
It's what came to mind. We're not allowed to have fun anymore. But in lieu of fun, Kate brought a mystery guest. So, Kate, introduce the mystery guest, who is dressed as a murder hornet in honor of In Lieu of Fun.
Yes. So my mystery guest today is my good friend and former colleague from when we were both in the PhD in law program at Yale Law School, Molly Brady. Molly is a law professor at Harvard. You might have heard of it, Harvard Law School in Cambridge, not outside of Boston. I like to make fun of her for this. And then anyways, where she teaches property. But I think kind of most importantly, you are one of the very few kind of true, kind of dorky, doctrinal, real property people by 30 years in this area. No one that isn't doesn't have skin sagging and liver spots everywhere does this. And so
this is a Zoom touch-up feature that I'm taking advantage of. I'm covered in liver spots right now.
Words you never thought you'd hear on Fun.
But I have been wanting to have, and what people don't know is that just because I do internet law, I also love real property. And Molly and I have weirdly parallel ways that we kind of approach scholarship. And I brought up whether or not people wanted to geek out with you, Moll, a couple of weeks ago at this point as a guest. And people were like, oh yeah, we would love to geek out about property. So I thought that today would be a great day. And we were going to start, I guess, with the newest edition of I guess we would call it, well, I don't know, it's, what is it when you call it, have an object that's property, that's not real property, just when
a chattel,
personal property.
Yeah.
Chattel was the word I was using. It just completely escaped me for a second. But your newest chattel, which is apparently this cocktail making carbonator with pods.
It is.
Yeah, we gotta hear about
Tell
this.
us everything.
You have a cocktail Keurig?
Yeah, basically.
What is it? How does it work? Walk us through it.
It's
Cocktail
called a
Keurig.
Bartesian. Yeah, it's called a Bartesian, which is a great name. I was actually gifted this for Christmas last year. So it is like a Keurig for cocktails where you have these different pods and then you have 4 different cylinders of liquors. And then you sort of attach them, and then it hydraulically pulls liquors depending on what the cocktail pod is. So there's a million different kinds, ranging from your standard margarita to really fancy holiday stuff. And yeah, so Bartesian, and I find it's that way you don't have to have the different bitters and mixers and things on hand.
And so the bitters are in the thing wow.
Yeah, so it uses the water, the mixer, and the bitters, and then the liquors that it pulls. Depending on every pod has a barcode on it that tells the scanner which liquors.
Code,
yeah, it's exactly right. Yeah, it's it is a pretty cool thing.
Is it
Kind of sounds like a Simpson character or something.
does it ever screw up and like you ask it for a margarita and it, you know, you sip thinking you're going to get a margarita and you get like a jolt of something else?
I've not had it screw up that way. Last year, before the world ended, I had a Super Bowl party, and of course, it was like the party trick because you could have like just basically a bucket of pods, and everyone can make whatever they want. But on that day, it did start randomly like spitting out the front a little bit until I like rinsed it out. So that was pretty exciting as people were being like coated in cosmopolitans and old fashions while trying to make them. But that's been the only malfunction.
Wow.
Are they good?
Cool.
They are pretty good. Yeah, so like I've tried a bunch of them. Like some of them are, you know, I would say like the old fashioned. I prefer my own old fashions, but particularly for something that has like a bunch of ingredients that you just don't feel like having on hand. Like this is pretty good. This is like apple juice and whiskey and I think a little bit of vodka. Yikes. But yeah, this is yeah. So I probably wouldn't have had like the apple juice on hand, for instance. So
Molly, are these things cost like $1 million? That's why I don't have.
I think they are. Like I said, the best part is my best friend in Charlottesville, which I used to teach at UVA. My best friend got me this as a Christmas gift, but I wasn't prepared for it. So I then had to take it home on the Amtrak to Boston. And so it's this like giant box that I had to carry like this in like the post-Christmas traffic. I think it's like $350. This is a good friend.
And they were like, how much do you like booze, Molly? And you were like, this much.
It also would not fit in the overhead rack on Amtrak. So I was like, pardon me, trying to jam my cocktail maker like near the bathroom on like the luggage racks. Very high class we are up here.
Wow. So it's a pretty expensive little machine.
It is.
And then do the pods set you way back as well?
I think the pods, I'm trying to remember. I haven't bought any in a little while. I want to say that they probably average out to a couple bucks per drink. So, you know, cheaper than a bar, but not as cheap as a thing of apple juice.
Right. Interesting.
I really mostly like, apparently you've had this for over a year. And this is the first time I'm hearing about it. I thought I was going to be fancy to come back at you with this thing and kind of, I thought that maybe you poured in the liquors and like, I don't know, or like something. And it was like, but it's so all done for you. But
my the tubes must be reservoirs of liquor that you add, right?
Yes, so you can add whatever brands, whatever you want. There's like a center tube of like water in the back, like a reservoir, just like a Keurig, and then there's 4 giant glass cylinders of liquor. I will take a video of myself making a second cocktail and share it with all of you on Twitter so you can watch. It's pretty cool to watch like the liquors drain out and it bubbles and it makes the whole thing. So you can tell me which one you want me to make, and I will display it for all of you.
Let's pick a hard one then. Let's pick a really hard one.
I have margaritas, old fashions. I have like cosmopolitans. I have a bunch of different like spiced coffee.
So there's a whiskey. There's a vodka. There's a rum.
Yeah, and there's actually a 5th cylinder that you have, but you have to like rotate in. So I think it's whiskey, tequila, vodka, gin, and rum. And so sometimes if you want to like switch out, I think it's the vodka and the gin. There's a comparatively few, I think, gin cocktails. I have a few, but
well, that's the wrong answer to everything. Comparatively few gin cocktails.
I know, or at least I own comparatively few.
Wow, this is
you're like
cool.
Yeah, you're like expanding Ben's chattel.
I have been I have spent more time than I care to admit because of In Lieu of Fun learning to make cocktails.
You make really good cocktails.
I have a regular daily date to have a drink with Kate, and so I have to have, but now I think I've, wasted my time. I should have just gotten Bartesian.
This sounds like a business expense, although I am not a tax professor. I don't understand how the world works beyond my very tiny sphere of real property.
Yeah, for all the income we're generating. With
deduct just losses on losses, Bartesian.
Exactly.
Exactly.
So welcome to the show. So I've asked our first poll
what's the first poll?
Whether the audience ever imagined they would voluntarily be in the situation that they're on. So far, we have a solid vote for truth-telling. That is, the people who say false are not pathological liars. So here's my question. I know the answer with respect to Kate, but I don't know the answer with respect to you. So, like, how did a comparatively normal person who is not, obviously psychotic and, like, become a property law scholar?
Yeah.
Are
again,
property law scholars known for being psychotic?
No, but they are known for being, generally speaking, old and pretty boring.
Yeah, liver
right?
spots. Yeah.
And you're not old and you don't seem boring. But, like, I don't think of it as something that, like, normal people do.
Yeah, I always tell my students that property is the trash television of law school. And I think that that's really kind of how I got into it, which is that I sort of was fascinated by the way that in property you toggle between extremely serious subjects, redlining, racial covenants, like, the history of discrimination. Well, yeah, so all those sorts of like very serious things. And then you'll have a case about like just a neighbor being horribly spiteful to another. Like, there's a case I sometimes teach about someone literally erecting a toilet on a pole in their backyard, like just so the neighbors have an ugly view. So I just sort of was fascinated by like these mean, evil, spiteful people, but then also all the
like that.
Yeah, so we all do.
No,
and
I mean, like literally with the toilets.
Really?
On posts?
Out by my, not on a post, but out by my cabin in the woods. As I can prove this to you, Kate. Matt Waxman will verify this. He has
really
seen it. Out by the cabin in the woods, there is this plot of land that the people who own it, for reasons known only to them, put toilets on the land. They're not connected to anything, but they're arranged in like a semicircle, and as though like people are going to come for a meeting or something.
Amazing.
Like in the Louis Buñuel film, they're going to show up and they're going to have a meeting sitting on the can. And sometimes there are more of them and sometimes there are less. They're always arranged in a, like sometimes there's 2 and they'll be facing each other. Sometimes there's 8 or 10. And I have never figured out what the message that they're trying to send with this is. But it's a good, it's exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, I'm going to need a picture of this for my slides because one of my favorite things to do is I put up a bunch of slides when I teach nuisance law, which is the tort that basically, protects against unreasonable uses of land by another. And aesthetic nuisance is a big topic. So you might have seen this story a few years ago now about the Flintstone house where a woman had like 1 million dinosaurs in her front lawn, or the emoji house where someone who was angry like painted emojis all over the house, or it sounds like a bunch of toilets in your neighbor's house, and whether a neighbor can sort of like force that person to modify their ugly thing on the property.
The truth is I love the toilets. I think I always, whenever I go up to the cabin, when I drive by the toilets, I always look to see like what position they're in, have they moved. When Matt Waxman from Columbia Law came out to the cabin once, I took a picture of him sitting contemplatively on one of the toilets.
Just for blackmail?
No, it was like a piece of art. I mean, he was wearing pants and everything, but it was I think the toilets are wonderful, and I think it's not an offensive gesture on the part of the neighbors. But I can imagine how if you erected one on the top of a pole for the purpose of annoying your neighbors, that would be considered a hostile gesture, yeah.
So what's really interesting, Kate will know this, is that ordinarily we don't consider motive terribly relevant in these sorts of disputes. Like my purpose in pissing off my neighbor is usually not given much credence. With one exception, which is the fabulous rabbit hole that I encourage everyone to fall in on spite fences and spite houses, which are truly like one of my favorite things to teach, which are structures, built just to bother someone. Usually it was because there would only be a sliver of land left and the person would try to sell it to the person with the bigger parcel next to them, they wouldn't buy. And so they'd be like, great, I'm going to construct something hideous. Exactly right. There's a great example of this, actually. One of my favorite examples is from San Francisco. There was a guy who bought an entire block of San Francisco and built a giant mansion, except for he couldn't acquire one lot. There was one holdout. And so he built a 40-foot three-sided wall around the guy. So he just lived in like permanent shade. The mansion ended up, I think it fell in the earthquake, but like there's pictures of this thing. I might have to find it and put it in the chat or something, because it's genuinely like, just the level of spite. See, this is why it's the trash TV of law school. I love it.
It is trash TV, but it's also like, it's really funny because I feel like you and I are kind of goofy people in some way as well. Also, as I think one of the questions in the chat we'll get into, but we take this also very seriously. But there's something really, I think it's just such a fun and human part of like, I mean, like everyone just has shit. And like everyone is going to have shit, and like maybe you will, and you're going to have to live somewhere. And so like all of these things end up coming to bear in your life in different ways, even though they seem kind of, I think it's because of like the rule against perpetuities, and I think it's because of maybe just how dry the mortgage crisis was and how kind of dry mortgages are in general and things like that people, it gets a bad rap. But
so if we wanted to spite fence Mar-a-Lago.
This leads to your light and projection thing, actually, Molly.
It's true, I
what
know.
would we have to do?
Well, I mean, you need to own neighboring land, right?
Or at least lease it.
That's right. Yeah. So in that case, I mean, you could build just some hideously ugly structure. I think it'll be interesting to see what people do in the future. As Kate mentioned, I have another paper on the projections that have ended up on places like the Trump Hotel. But
I love that guy.
Yeah. Molly wrote a brilliant paper, like it's in the Harvard Law Review, an incredible kind of changing how people think about light as a nuisance. Because right now the law does not recognize light as a nuisance. So you can shine a light into your neighbor's house every single day, and there's nothing that anyone can do about it.
Excellent.
I know.
I am so on that.
I have a bunch of amazing pictures, and there's these sort of, interesting groups. There's one on Facebook that does this sort of projection a lot.
Wait. We're getting questions about this. So there is a guy in Washington. He's an artist, and he works in the form of projected light, and he likes to project things like the text of the Emoluments Clause onto the Trump Hotel. This requires a certain amount of being sleuthy, getting access to places with direct views of it, and rather powerful projecting equipment. He is done it successfully now a bunch of times. He's also projected light onto the Justice Department a couple times. He's been very resourceful, and he's got a Twitter feed. And I have to say, all of Washington loves him. He's a kind of local hero, and we're very attached to him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is Robin Bell, who does a ton of it. What I think is really interesting is, my paper sort of makes the case that there's a difference between public and private property. And particularly what I'm worried about are other groups. So, for Robin Bell, there is a different group called Survivors of the Abortion Holocaust that projects images of fetuses, and then also, nativity scenes on the sides of PacSuns and businesses. Nobody's really gone after a home yet, but I'm sort of worried about how we balance the property interest against First Amendment interests. I think in the public property case, it's in some ways simpler, in some ways harder than it is in the private property case. So my piece is pours a little water, I think, on projection as a means of protest.
And what's your argument about when like what the rule should be?
Yeah, so basically what I do, so my approach generally is I am kind of doctrinal and historical. I really like to blend kind of doctrinal, historical, and institutional scholarship toward thinking about these like theoretical or normative questions. Oh God, I use normative. What a law professor.
We have a drinking game in
drink
the chat.
for normative. Sorry, everyone. I hate myself. But in any event, what I did is basically I went back and looked at this long history of the common law and every claim that had ever been raised related to light. And what's fabulous is there's actually the first case relating to light was about a late night croquet game by torchlight with cigars. Like, it sounded amazing, but nonetheless, the neighbors didn't like it too much. And what I should say is, as to whether a nuisance can reach light. It can if you directly shine in windows and disrupt someone's sleep. I think I saw some stuff in the chat about like how do lasers in airplanes work. Same general reasoning. If you're actually like interfering with a person's ability to focus or see, that's a different story. But what I kind of got out of this long history of treatments of light in the common law and discussions of kind of the communicative interests that people have in their properties is that we recognize and protect those things. In fact, it goes back to aesthetic nuisance. We say, hey, that's your land. If you want to put a bunch of toilets on it, go for it. But we don't really let your neighbors, impinge on you in that way and making you take it down. It seems kind of strange to have that asymmetry to let people project and put stuff on your property that you don't want there. And so, yeah, the paper kind of develops a few initial ideas about kind of how to balance the property and First Amendment interests here. I do think there's a reasonable claim that you might have some First Amendment defenses to projections onto things, whether it's because the property is hedging toward public interest or whether because there's few or any alternatives that people can use to get their message across. But generally, I'm not a huge fan of them.
Yeah. I love them. I think that they're I also see the slippery slope that you talk about, but I think that there's such an interesting question when you're targeting a private hotel, for example, that, but which is owned by and named after like a public figure, a public, so like that is, I think, the exact kind of crux, and you're targeting the private hotel for the purpose of protesting the government and the public figure. Like, that seems to be like pretty like First Amendment specific, like very First Amendment protected. So I don't know. I think that I'm much on this issue. I think it's like there's not enough conversation about First Amendment.
Yeah.
Like First Amendment in general and property, and where these lines start to like cross. People think about them as so different.
And there's easy cases and hard cases, right? So I think the easy case is like somebody comes and projects something random on my house or says, Molly Brady is a bitch or whatever. Like, that becomes slightly different than I think when you're in the Trump area. It's actually interesting. I think someone told me that
more likely in your case they'd project "make me a cosmopolitan."
That's right. But
I won't turn this off until I get an old fashioned.
I don't think though that that it's funny because like that some torts might overlap, right? Like, you can imagine if you put Molly Brady as a whore, whatever. Maybe this is not the subject of defamation, but you could imagine defamation or things that would be defamatory on people's houses. But there could also be just entirely truthful things that I don't want on the side of my house. Take, for example, the extremely obnoxious stuff associated. I actually mentioned this in the paper, like Molly Brady teaches at a law school just outside Boston, or some like nonsense like that would be factually true, but still hyper like embarrassing to have on the side of your house. So yeah, I think there are like ways that we constitute and represent ourselves through the things that we own. That includes personal and real property. And so I'm really interested in kind of thinking, about how we balance these different considerations.
So I have a question about the distinction between public and private property for this purpose. So the Trump Hotel in Washington is actually public property.
Post office, right.
It is what those of us who were DC natives used to call the old post office pavilion. And it's a gorgeous old building that somehow the General Services Administration decided to lease out. The Trump organization leased it. And so in your construct, is this projection onto, it's clearly not like projecting onto Molly's house.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, it is a private business, but it's a private business that's leasing a government office or government facility. How should we think about that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think leases raise some of the biggest problems here of public property. So this is like what I would call one of the hardest cases in that middle gray area. A lot of times we do have kind of defaults to formalism here, i.e. like who holds the title. And if you're a lessee, it's still public property. So I think that does in some ways neatly help me around the problem. That said, I think Kate and I are both deeply, deeply interested in this distinction between public and private. And this is actually where if you have questions about how somebody who's written an article on 18th century meets and bounds and someone who's written an article on internet law can have a lot to talk about in this space. I think that there are ways. I can think of like private streets, for instance. Some of you may live on them. There we have something that is functionally private, but because the public can access it, we're not exactly sure how to treat like protests on private streets. We have different ways of treating parking on private streets. So who we title things with and what rights inhere in the public with respect to those things, I think is just really a really interesting question.
Yeah. There was a paper that I wanted to write at one point. I'm still trying to get Molly to write it with me. That's about Waze, and it's all about kind of how Waze and Google Maps totally like erased the friction that kept people off of like private and side streets. And it was just like a lack of knowledge of how to maneuver a lot of like these huge like back labyrinths of side streets that kept people off them and on the highways. And then once Waze came along, they were like, oh, do you want to leave this 6-lane highway in LA and instead go through Echo Park, through all of these tiny little neighborhoods? And that kind of adjustment to how people like to traffic patterns completely changed the property values in all of those neighborhoods. There were deaths, like more traffic related deaths. There were, local government could not respond to it in the way that local government had ever responded to things like this before, because there was just no way to kind of, necessarily everything that created more externalities. I just think it's a really great example.
Think of the amount of commuting hours that were shaved off.
I know. Or like, it's so
you're
crazy.
Missing the bright side.
I know. I just think
about all those traffic hours that weren't.
It was really funny though, because it did happen in a bunch of different areas. And then like what happened was these neighboring municipalities, one would do things like put in speed bumps all over, just like tons and tons of speed bumps, which meant that then the algorithm redirected them to not go through these areas with all the speed bumps. And then the shift in traffic, all of the bad stuff that shifted in traffic happened to like shifted to municipalities that couldn't get their act together in time to put in speed bumps and stop signs. And so just like all of these, I just think it's kind of a fascinating thing and nobody talks about it. So at some point I'll make you write it with me, Molly.
No, I'm definitely, I'm really interested in these questions. I saw people in the chat talking too about, there's just so many ways in which, again, to go back to sort of like, why does property matter? The cases on the malls, right? Those are about public-private distinction. There's a case the Supreme Court is going to hear this term that is going to be extremely interesting to watch called Cedar Point Nursery, about whether union organizers can access private workspaces, which California law currently requires on a certain number of days a year, whether that activity, that regulation requiring the access is a constitutional taking. These questions about public and private property are just everywhere. So I think that the fact that it gets a bad rap is kind of tragic.
Yeah. I totally agree. Do you want to go to questions?
Sure. So our first question is from somebody who I have to scold momentarily before I let him ask a question. Greg McNeil, who's an old friend, a great American, and whom I have not seen in a long time. It's good to see you, and I'm going to put all the blame for our not being in touch on you, because I'm the host and I get to do that. It's great to see your face. Yeah, Greg is a professor in California. He's a very thoughtful guy, and he used to write for Lawfare a fair bit. He hasn't written for Lawfare for a while. Greg, I'm going to scold you about that.
You'll welcome me back. Maybe I will.
You're welcome back anytime, dude. It's good to see you.
Good to see you. Good to see everyone.
And the floor is yours.
Wow. Well, thanks for that gracious introduction and scolding. You know, I'm gonna like start crying now. So, well, this is cool, Molly. Property was my worst course in law school, but I love it because stuff comes up all the time about it. And California is bonkers on property stuff. Like you go walk on the beach and people are like screaming about who owns beach access and like who puts up a fence that can't let people get through. So I posted a question in the questions, but I actually have two questions now that I got teleported in.
You can do two. You can
whatever you want.
So
because you have a property interest now in your presence on the screen.
I do. So I'm going to ask my personal interest question first, and I have an opinion about this. I don't have an opinion about the other question. Do you believe that landowners, how about this, landowners can exclude low-flying drones from flying over their property, and if so, at what altitude? And like the ALI is taking this up now, and there's a whole bunch of interesting stuff, and it's like a mixed trespass property hot button topic. And Ben and I have been like kicking it around since 2015 in a Brookings.
Yeah, I mean it's actually been hanging around in a different context for a long time.
Oh, a bunch of people have written about this.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Mel.
So a couple things. First, I should say that I am an associate reporter on the restatement for the property. So in that sense, I'm a little conflicted.
Tell us more.
Yeah, so we're working on this problem. But I think the thing that we're afraid of, if it tilts too far in favor of the sorts of legislation that I think industry has tended to propose here, is it boils down to like a 45-factor test, with the 46th factor being, and any reasonable incursion we believe is necessary or something, right? So that seems really bad and wrong, and to leave like maximum flexibility. So actually, I've written in a different context about how the law of navigability involves. So navigability is the touch word here for how we think of what sorts of airspace we permit people to use. So traditionally, of course, because it was commercial airliners, the navigable airspace was relatively limited. I've written a paper about navigability in the water context and how that evolved as like new forms of craft got smaller and smaller, and people started being like, oh, look, I can canoe down this stream and therefore like go wherever I want. And so I think that's actually kind of a useful analog. What's ended up happening is you've ended up with like a million different common law definitions of what counts as navigable, kind of depending on the place. So some states, it's like in the water context, able to float a railroad tie. Others, it's, recreational because that's more important for the state. I think we're likely to see some sort of test at least be recommended that I think will balance sort of like in urban space. It's just sort of impossible to imagine people kind of objecting in highly urban spaces to, drones traveling over streets. Whereas in other places, it seems like it would be more intrusive. And there might be things, again, that emerge, I think, from nuisance law, right? Which looks at sort of like how unreasonable is the interference. If there's a community that is suffering from a ton of noise or drone traffic or whatever that really affects people's ability to use and enjoy their land, I think nuisance law actually provides us with a lot of flexibility and a standard that was able to. Nuisance law dates back centuries, and it's evolved to encompass things like the railroad and industrialization. Like there's a lot that emerges, I think, from nuisance that will be instructive as we think about how this gets regulated.
That's a great law professor answer. But my question was, what do you think?
Sorry. So here's the thing. I mean, I am sort of like a common law nuisance wonk.
Yeah.
So my answer is, I think, very similar to what I just said, which is like, I think a lot of this has to be figured out case by case. Before actually we get regulation. So I would expect, I think actually the common law reasoning that underlies eventual regulation will be significant. And as I said, as a nuisance wonk, I'm much more sympathetic to sort of how judges think about these problems and what the reasonable uses are than most, because most would say no, we just need legislation that prescribes, 30 feet and under, which we may well see. But I think that some sort of case by case reasoning about what's different between urban, suburban, industrial, all of those sorts of things, I actually think it could be interesting whether we get something like drone streets in the air, which obviously the drone industry doesn't want, but which is probably one of the better ways to think about limiting sort of the access and the externalities. So I am also a lover, as I said, of streets. So I think that's another possibility.
So can I ask you guys a question about this that I think is really interesting. When I was in Montana at one point, I was hiking, and out of like literally I was in the backwoods. I don't think I had seen anyone for like 7 or 8 hours. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, I saw a drone, and it was flying fairly low, and it was just like in a glade in a clearing. I had no idea where the person operating it was. And I was thinking about this thing that you said, Mal, about like different areas and where you would draw different limits on how low it could go and what the privacy interest would be. Like, I guess you'd think that if you were in an urban setting, you'd want to send like maybe a 50-foot like level, right? So that you could have more privacy. Whereas like maybe you wouldn't set any levels at all in like the woods or whatever.
Woods, yeah.
But it occurred to me that like when you're in the woods, you have a very great expectation of privacy and isolation and the idea that nobody is watching you. And so like
but in Montana in the woods, you're likely to be armed. So if a drone comes at you, just shoot it down.
My bear didn't go that far, Ben.
It's funny you went to privacy there, Kate, because so I read this study. They did this poll of some people in Europe where Europeans were passing some new drone-related regulations, and at some university, I can't remember the name of it, did a study, and they asked this question that I thought was so fascinating. They asked how someone would feel about a low-altitude drone with a camera. And people said, that feels like a privacy violation to me. Then they asked, and if we took the camera off, those people, a significant number of those people also said that felt like a privacy violation. But and they were characterizing privacy in this way with a concept of sort of like this idea of wanting to be left alone as opposed to sort of observational or informational privacy. And so like the woods I think of as like, maybe I don't expect that I can go jogging through the woods of Montana naked and nobody will see me, but I probably expect that I'm mostly going to be left alone while I'm doing that, and that the drone operator isn't going to be bothering me or following me.
I guess it goes to kind of your question that you tried to nail down, Molly, on, which is just kind of what's your like intuitive take on like how you'd feel about a drone. Like, or like about like the policing of a drone and at what level. And I guess at that level, I guess what was interesting to me is running it through kind of, I was surprised that I came to a different metric of like, well, maybe I'd want like to have some privacy, not in a park or something like that.
But here's the thing, I was also naked. Too. So here's the thing about nuisance law, I think, that is kind of beautiful. And, I do think that if there is this physicality thing that means it would, in the drone context, it would be a trespass instead of the nuisance, but probably what we see elsewhere, which is, sort of like the softening of trespass to attain some nuisance-like factors. Your expectations right now are shaped by things as they are, right? In a world in which we're all used to Amazon drones, who knows how long it'll take before we're all like, oh yeah, I don't expect privacy anywhere, right? And so like I think
privacy
that,
by obscurity, like I mean that's like an extension of the privacy by obscurity kind of idea,
right? And so I think that like that's sort of the evolutionary capacity I think of the common law in this area is interesting, and because it can be a little case by case, but we'll see.
The FAA claims that the navigable airspace is anywhere where an aircraft can operate, and so drones can operate from a millimeter above the blade of grass to as high as they can fly. And so they claim this regulatory authority then over all aspects of the airspace. And then if like a local government wants to say, as a matter of local property law, you can't fly over someone's property at 50 feet above their backyard, the FAA claims that would be preempted. So and then we have a big like fight that's going to come up about property rights constitutionally in Cosby, and this is all stuff. But
I love Cosby. FAA like basically took the ad column doctrine and just like made it their own.
Well, this is the thing though, right? And I mean, this used to come up in the earliest air cases, right? So there's a case called Hinman, I think, versus Pacific Transport, and there's a related case called Edwards versus Sims. That's one of my favorite cases to teach about Sims, which is what do we actually own? And it seems like courts kind of go back and forth between like what we are currently using and what we are capable of using. right? So like what we are capable of building into, in the sense, like could I extend my house by a story and end up using that space, therefore that space is not navigable. And so it'll also be interesting, I think, to see which of those kind of theories of what we own as far as real property goes ends up winning out, because that would help us in the millimeter above the blade of grass context. Like, of course, I'm reasonably using things in a zone surrounding my house, and perhaps that's shaped by existing nuisance law, existing regulations, et cetera. And so there might be some sort of like sphere, almost like the Fourth Amendment curtilage idea that emerges. It'd be interesting.
I was just gonna say, isn't that Kylo? I can't really isn't Kylo the Sandra Day O'Connor helicopter? Yeah, in the curtilage around the house.
Kylo
was the heat sensor, right?
Yeah.
Oh,
Riley. In Florida v. Riley, one of the concurrences,
that's
one
what
of the
it was.
justices said something like, "Imagine in the future a device that could slip in just over a fence line into someone's backyard undetected." And it was like, really? It was like 1989 or something when Riley came out and predicted sort of drones. It's funny, Ben, this was not my question, and we went way off.
Well, we should go on to your other question.
Yeah, sorry.
So, and I'll be quiet on this one because I just sort of threw it out there because every time I encounter a property person or I'm on a panel about data privacy, I don't have an opinion about this issue at all, but I like to say whatever the thing is that'll most fire people up. And so the question is, do you have a strong opinion about whether we have a property right in our data? And the debate, right? And so we'd love to hear your thoughts.
So complicated.
See you later, Greg.
See you guys.
Tell us everything.
So to be the law professor again, no, I don't have a strong opinion. But so I should say that I'm a property land use scholar. So like most of the stuff that I get really animated about is land, as opposed to sort of like intangibles. But there's some really interesting new work being done, I think, on the dangers of propertization, right? Once you recognize something as property, then it becomes subject to all the constitutional requirements about takings and due process. Like the choice to recognize something as common law property has radiating consequences that are really long lasting and difficult to undo. And so I think it matters less that we call something property and matters more that you think really critically about what rights you want to give someone relationally with respect to the thing, rather than sort of like treating it as property writ large. I think that's the only strong opinion I have, is that's a bad development to try to propertize things in the first instance, because it does carry all these giant consequences.
Yeah.
So David Botts asks a very important question on behalf of the entire viewership. Can your fancy machine make chocolatinis?
Oh, wow. I don't know. This makes me want to Google in my other screen. I think it makes coffee. It makes coffee ones, but I'm gonna have to look right now at whether it makes chocolate martinis. I'll report back.
All right. While you do that, Richard, the floor is yours.
All right. Well, you can hear me okay?
Yep.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, good. Okay. For those of us who don't know the law, I was wondering if you could just give us the lay of land in the world of property law. And the sorts of things I'm wondering about is, how is intellectual property different, qualitatively different from other forms of property from the perspective of legal theory? And also something that's maybe related, may not be. Can obnoxious sounds violate someone's property rights? Because I have in mind here leaf blowers and the Mr. Softy truck.
Very good question.
I hate leaf blowers. Yeah, so much.
Car alarms.
That's where I want to put toilets in my front yard, is every time someone brings a leaf blower out. So sounds can generate harms that lead to the rise to the level of nuisances. The nuisance standard is hard. It requires a significant interference. So it can't just be, my neighbors threw a loud party once. It has to be like recurring and extremely, difficult to live with. And courts also really love things that actually devalue the property as opposed to just bothering you. So in that sense, sounds don't always get you the full way that like sort of some sort of physical consequence, like the sounds or vibrations causing cracks in your house would. And then of course you have a bigger problem. I should say real quickly on the projection, or related to the earlier projection discussion, there is an interesting case, or not a case, but a set of facts where there has been some evidence to like do things sort of like sound throwing is the wrong idea, but to make it sound like there are sounds coming from someone's property. And I think this was done actually in response to the ICE detentions or family separation, where there was like sort of children crying coming from ICE. And so I think that's another example of a sort of like, as we think about kind of what somebody's property rights are, if somebody made it sound like leaf blowers were coming from my property, I think that's an interesting fact pattern. Good thing for an exam. Hopefully my students aren't listening. The other thing I'll say about the intellectual property question is this is a deeply, deeply contested issue, is whether intellectual property should even be called property. Question. Yeah. So there's huge debates about this, whether intellectual property is at all, again, back to the risks of propertization, whether we should really consider it like property, whether property, the notion of it like property, has led to more exclusivity than is optimal. And so this is a very fraught debate. In fact, I think last fall, Richard Epstein of Chicago and Mark Lemley of Stanford had a debate called "Is Intellectual Property Property?" And so I do teach a little bit of intellectual property in my property course.
And which sides were they on, though, Mal? Do you remember?
I can
imagine.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure Epstein was on the side of everything is property and Lemley was not. I think that, I do teach it in property because in the first unit in my property class, we talk about what is the proper subject of property, natural resources, things, IP, personality rights, like the right of publicity, like my distinctive voice. And so what's the right subject and what are the exceptions to ownership in all those instances? And so I think it's useful there. I also view the property course as a great opportunity to show students all the upper level things that are even tangentially related that they might really like to take. And so I think it's a good opportunity to introduce students to that wide open and super interesting field. So that's the reason I do it.
The Big Blue Blogger has a question, although he is dark and in the gloaming and thus less blue than usual.
Oh, now I'm very white. Yikes. Sorry about the glare. Molly, you have a beautiful space there. Maybe a little too pristine for in lieu of fun. You may need to bring in a dog or something to shed on it. My question, since for the last 4 years, every conversation inevitably turns to Donald Trump, I figure the same is true in the faculty lounge. I'm wondering what sort of fun facts property profs have shared about the Trump organization and its properties that you could now share with us.
Yes, good question. So 2 things immediately came to mind, and I will try to find a link. One is, speaking of like spite fences and bad neighbors, I believe there's a really interesting story about how Donald Trump acquired the Virginia winery that now is Trump Winery. If I recall correctly, it involved him buying the front lawns such that people couldn't access the house anymore. And so I will find the link to that because I think I know where it is and share that in the chat. The other favorite thing that comes to mind is conservation easements. So conservation easements are a very odd thing. So basically they are promises not to develop your property any further that you convey to a qualified recipient, usually something like a land trust or local government, and in exchange you get huge amounts of tax benefits. This is ostensibly because, let's say that my house is 2 stories, I could build to 4. I am giving up the extra money that I could get if I built to my full capacity, so I get a tax deduction when I convey the conservation easement to Nature Conservancy. So this was sort of touted as like a great market, approach to environmental conservation. The terrifying thing is how these credits are both valued and then who is actually claiming them. So Trump is often at the top of the list of people who are using conservation easements toward tax deductions. And usually it's on properties that are golf courses or hotels. So these are things that are already like either developed or they're at the use that is wanted, and yet there's these massive millions and millions of dollars of tax credits that are being claimed through the conservation easement program. And these are locally administered, again, market. And so that program, I think conservation easements generally, we really need to reevaluate how that's working as a tax strategy.
That's kind of interesting. I had missed that about his conservation easements.
Yeah, I will find things.
Mr. Daniel Burge, wearing blue again in a defiant gesture, against the natural order of things. What's on your mind?
So I'm curious, what is the strangest property law you are aware of?
Oh, I'm so excited. So I have to calm down. Okay. Woo. All right, I have to calm down. Oh my gosh, this is such a fun question. So probably, sorry. Okay, this is real unfiltered Molly.
I just want to say for a second that like Molly came to visit me for like one night, like and stayed in a different part of the house and blah blah blah, like a few months ago. And what we did the entire trip was like I gave you a tour of like where a former spite fence had been and fallen down. And then I took you to another spot that was a conservation easement. And then we went around and talked about the high tide line all around the beach. And this was literally like solid like 4 hours of our day, of our one day together.
So property field trips are all I care about. But here's my favorite thing, I think. So at least this is the quirkiest thing, or the thing that I think people also most associate with me. So I did a project, as I mentioned, on like 18th century property descriptions, in which I got very interested in how on earth we still have properties and have historically had properties that are genuinely in the land records mentioned as from the rock to the tree to the other tree to the fence. Right. And like the trees are gone, the fence is gone, but that's still the description. And so I got very interested in like, why did we do this? Was it just because there was no better way, whatever? What I ended up learning in the process of researching kind of how people describe land was that there's this old practice called perambulation, where people used to like ceremonially walk boundaries. This still happens sometimes between like state boundaries. But they used to ceremonially like walk with their neighbors. I imagine they would drink and they would like go around and walk to the tree, walk to the rock. And this was also called beating the bounds because they would strike the boundaries with like long sticks or willows. But they would also—
Why did we do this together, Molly?
I know. There's a whole holiday. There's a whole holiday called Terminalia, February 23rd. I celebrate it every year. I send paperless posts about like doing this together. But in any event, they also used to not just whack the boundaries, they would actually whack the children that were along with them on the walks. This is called beating the bounds. Why? Because they thought the kids would remember where the tree was if they got like whacked as they were walking around it. So like if they
that
would be
sounds
like, oh,
very
yeah.
sensible.
I mean, it was the 18th century. Times were tough. But I was very fascinated that like these things that seemed very incomprehensible, I also noticed when people were litigating boundaries, they would bring back, people, there'd be like some 70-year-old who would come in and testify and be like, oh my gosh, yeah, I remember where that fence was. It was over there. And you're like, obviously, because you got, whacked next to it. Or, I remember that stream. Right. I remember that stream.
I'd remember it too if I was needlessly whacked.
Yeah. So perambulation, it's interesting. In parts of Virginia, like when I presented this paper to a group of friends once, like practicing before a talk.
And they're like, oh, we still do that.
Yes. Like one of my friends from Southwest Virginia was like, wait, I went out with my grandpa like every year and I didn't get whacked, but like we would, on Thanksgiving go walk the boundaries and find the fence and find the tree. Like this passage of collective memory, I just think it's super cool. So perambulation is my favorite arcane law.
That is a great answer to a great question. So I have been working to bring Fubar in to ask Fubar's question, and I have failed, which I have a dual motive in bringing Fubar in. One is to ask the question, but the other is to resolve the question of whether we have actually ever seen Fubar on screen, which Kate and I have different memories about. That we'll have to wait for another day, but I will read Fubar's question. Would America benefit from a right to roam law like the ones in certain European countries?
Ooh.
We've talked about, that's a great question.
Super interesting. So
what is a right to roam law?
Yeah, so Scotland is the country I most associate with this. So if we think of like, again, the right to exclude being kind of a core property right, as I recall, the right to roam is kind of like a customary like entitlement to walk through and use the property.
Bushwhack.
Yeah, well, we actually have historically had some things that sort of approximate this. Again, I teach a case in this vein about in South Carolina, there used to be like an easement such that you could hunt on anyone's property. In Virginia, I think there still is, if I remember correctly.
I'm not sure about that, because
or for
Virginia
nuisance
has
animals.
because the area of Virginia that my cabin is in, everybody has signs on their property
Posting,
that are
right.
like, "Don't you dare hunt on my property," and "I have open carry and I will shoot you if you trespass."
Right.
You know, I hunt people who hunt on my property, that kind of thing.
Right, but I think the posting is to overcome the easement. Like, I think that's actually like a
I
legal
see.
requirement.
I was just going to say that. It was like, that actually sounds to me like something that you put up because otherwise people would. Yeah.
Yeah. And so anyway, I think that like in South Carolina, there's a very interesting case about this called McConaughey versus Singleton, where they say basically like there's social value in hunting and letting people freely cross properties. And this is, 19th century case. And this is the question I would say I get most often from friends is, how can I tell if there's an easement there? Like, because they want to wander on some property that they just don't know. And it's really hard to figure out. You have to like search the land records. Again, I think case by case stuff is probably best here. I think it'd be, there would be constitutional takings problems probably with any sort of ordinance that tried to force people to accept rights to roam. On the other hand, we also do know that you can eventually, through long acquired continuous use, acquire things like prescriptive easements or customary access. So I think it'd be a messy road to get anything like the right to roam, just because you wouldn't be able to do it very easily through top-down means. It would kind of take collective action over the long term.
Tony Cava, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone, and happy post-Thanksgiving. Hi.
Happy
My question is-
happy light denim Sunday.
There you go. My wife is home with the dog, so things might get loud. My question is about my brother, who kind of thinks he's a libertarian, you might say, without knowing it. He seems to think that when his neighbor's garden, say tomatoes, grows close enough to grab, there you go, close enough to grab from the sidewalk, that it's, it's open season on the neighbor's
I just want you to know, Tony Cava, that I talked to Molly about tomato poaching before I ran my entire. She was my first call. She was so excited.
Yeah. Well, the thing he does is, if his tomatoes are within reach, of course, he protects them jealously. But he figures the neighbors are open season, so just curious which it is.
This really is a question that Kate did ask me, and then she showed me where the tomatoes were, keeping with our property field trip theme. She was like, "What do you think?" So I mean, it's interesting. Right?
I can do that.
We won't reveal whether Kate actually took the tomatoes. We all know, but
Steals shellfish. She obviously would go for the tomatoes. You need them to cook. You need them to cook the shellfish.
What's mine is mine. What's yours is mine too.
Yours is mine. Yeah, exactly.
It's this is actually, so it becomes, of course, tricky when it's not accessible from the sidewalk, right? Because then we're like classically interfering with the right to exclude. But even I think if it's reachable from the sidewalk, right, then we have sort of a chattel personal property conversion claim, I think. That said, if you're sort of like, if you view the thing as abandoned because maybe the tomato, falls onto the sidewalk, or the apple is, falling on the sidewalk or whatever, then we're back to the land of, okay, anything that is abandoned, we can freely acquire the same way you can, a quarter on the sidewalk or something like that. But I'm going to be a formalist and say, cannot take while attached.
What if it's hanging over your property?
Also, really hard question.
That's the same as trimming. That's the same as trimming like a tree or something, except it's like the contrapositive, I guess.
Second thing I get most commonly asked is about tree law, which is a holy mess. Like that is just so, because this problem has come up so often, there's just full like local codes or common laws dealing with sort of like who bears responsibility for trees, who has to, if the tree falls, like whatever. So there are entire like books. I have a tree law book, of course, that sort of talks about like different state rules on this.
All right. The end of the episode poll is up.
Yay.
And Martine, you get the last question.
Right, I'm not sure if I'm on because my phone is being weird, but I'll. So I'm an oceanographer, I grew up on the West
But
Coast,
we
so I care a
love
lot about beaches.
the image is awesome.
Yeah.
Oh, great. So I grew up on the West Coast where like
perfect.
the beach is free access, and I went to Woods Hole for a summer, and like the actual institute owns a private beach, and the concept of a private beach just seems like a crime against humanity to me. And so can you explain to me either A, that I'm sort of violently wrong, or why there are a bunch of heathens on the East Coast?
Yeah, so let me
Good question.
Yeah, let me take this chance to pitch a book by a great former colleague at UVA. His name is Andrew Carl, and he wrote a book called Free the Beaches about the basically racist origins of private beach laws that made the beaches private where they formerly had not been. And so this is a story particularly about beaches in Connecticut, which of course is the most economically segregated state, or one of them.
And which, by the way, has famously lousy beaches because they're all on the goddamn Long Island Sound, and Connecticut has no ocean beaches. And so for people in Connecticut to be like private and exclusionary about their beaches is like hoarding crap.
Yeah.
So
this,
just saying.
That book is incredible, and so that really talks about some of the really disturbing ordinances, really disturbing origins of some specific beach laws. I think the idea initially behind sort of like private waterways, private land under waterways, this goes back again to Old English common law about kind of who can make best use of a thing. We don't want, again, navigable waterways, the land they're under, to be private. But if it's sort of a seasonal stream, maybe awarding private rights will make somebody use it to the best capacity and take care of it, ensure it's dredged and whatever else. When it comes to beaches, especially now with what we've seen with like Kosla, hopefully I'm pronouncing that right, acquiring all the land around a beach to try to make Millionaire's Beach or Billionaire's Beach, whatever it was called, those sorts of things. Now we see really bad strategic behavior in this area. I do think there is such deep customary public law running behind kind of beach access and the openness of those things that those have fortunately to date not gone very far, efforts to kind of privatize and limit public access in places like California. But I really recommend Andrew Carl's book on this.
Do you know the Great Ponds Law, Molly?
Oh,
That's
yeah, in Massachusetts. Yeah, super cool.
It's like in a few places, but the Great Ponds Law is basically, I think it's like 50,000 hectares, or like the volume or something of like, depending on how big the pond is, you have, it's similar to the beach laws, which is that you can cross any undeveloped land to get to a pond and use the pond for fishing, like recreation or anything else. Basically, if it's like of a big enough size. Even if it's completely privately owned all the way around it. So
there we are, back to public and private, right where we started.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Molly Brady, you're a great American. It's been a pleasure to meet you. You have the oddest system for making cocktails I have ever heard of. We will expect a tweeted video.
Oh my God, I'm really looking forward to make it. Okay, you pick we'll talk about it. What do you think, Ben? What should we have them? What should we have?
I think Molly should put up a Twitter poll with the choice of cocktails for the In Lieu of Fun audience. You guys should vote, and then we should get a video of the relevant cocktail being made. You game for that, Molly?
I'm ready to do it. I will reply to your tweet. Yep.
All right. So, we will be back. Tomorrow's guest is the great filmmaker, and by the way, the only filmmaker, to my knowledge, to have a film in which I appear, Alex Gibney. I was a stand-in for Jim Comey in one of Alex's recent films, he has a new film out about just how disastrous the COVID response has been. I have not seen that film yet, but I hope he will not take offense at that. That will be 22 hours and 57 minutes from now. And until then, Kate?
We don't have fun anymore, but we do get to watch the what is it called? The Bartini?
Bartesian.
Bartesian.
Well, martini makes sense. It rhymes with martini. That's like a totally reasonable thing.
Trademark missed
Maybe we should start a
opportunity.
competitor organization.
Yes, exactly.
Bartini.
It would
Yeah,
just
we get
be-
to.
It would just be me in a box with lots of bottles of alcohol. What could possibly go wrong?
And we will, and the In Lieu of Fun Twitter feed, as well as Kate and my personal Twitter feed, will retweet both the poll and the resulting video. So this is an In Lieu of Fun extra this evening. We will see you tomorrow. Thank you, Molly.
Bye,
Great to
Mom.
meet
Talk
you.
to you soon.